Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the week 7 and hopefully the last video lecture for readings in American and British literature. All right, so that means next week we will be meeting in person. So I should see you on Wednesday, the 20th of October at 10 a.m. in room 404. All right, I am looking forward to that. I hope you are as well. I feel like we can do much more if we're meeting in person. We can have a much more enjoyable time and a much more rewarding time in the study of this literature. In that class, I would like to review the upcoming midterm, or review for the upcoming midterm, and really help to prepare for that. All right. The midterm will be held on the Friday of next week at our regularly scheduled time of 9 o'clock until 11 o'clock in the morning. Same room, room 404. And actually in this video, at the end of this video, I will discuss a little bit just what the basics of the midterm are and how to prepare and be successful on that. But basically, for next Wednesday's class, bring your questions and be prepared to try and review it. All right. That should be very helpful for us. All right. Anyway, as I said, at the end of today's video, in this video, I will briefly discuss about what the midterm is and what you should prepare for on that. All right. But first, let's get to Araby. Okay, again, I love James Joyce, and I love discussing literature and analyzing it, especially with you. So let's get into the discussion questions. All right, now, as I was preparing for this, I had so much to say. I think I wrote 8 pages just for this video. I'll try to be brief here, but there are just so many directions that I can go into. I don't know if that is just because of my appreciation and respect for James Joyce's ability, or just his ability alone in this story. My guess is it's a bit of both. So I have a tendency to deeply engage in James Joyce's work. I know I'm not alone there, but I'm curious if you do too. All right, so no matter what I say today, again, keep an open mind to all the different possible readings that are out there. But again, as always, and this is important for your midterm, remember that the best answers are ones that can be reasonably and convincingly explained with a good rational argument and probably some evidence from text or from history, all right, or both, or other sources as well. Okay, but we want to present a reasonable, rational answer to our questions. And remember that, you can say anything, but extraordinary answers, some might say crazy answers, require extraordinary explanation and extraordinary evidence. Okay, so you can say what you want, but the more extraordinary it is, the thing you say, it's going to take a lot more work to really convince people of that idea. All right, so keep that in mind. All right, I will just review the 6 questions that I gave you here. Some of my answers will overlap a little bit, and hopefully I'll try to stay on a kind of unified path. But as I said, there is so much to say about this story, and I do want to get into the various different layers of ways to read this story. All right, and the ways that I've chosen to or focused on here, they are ways that you can read this story that don't exclude the other readings. So the readings I'm giving here are layered in a way that they're not exclusive. Okay, they're inclusive. You can understand these different meanings simultaneously or at the same time. At least I believe so. But again, keep an open mind, and that means a critical and skeptical mind, and see what you think about these analyses about this fascinating story, Araby. All right, as always, I ask you to briefly summarize the story in your own words, okay, not somebody else's words, and in English. All right, so let me just do that briefly here. Basically, this story is about an adolescent or early teenage unnamed boy who becomes obsessed with a neighborhood girl. All right, you could say he falls in love with her. I would prefer the word obsession because it doesn't seem like a two-way thing, and that's a one-way love is not really love, is it? So he becomes obsessed with a neighborhood girl who is only referred to as Mangan's sister. Okay, Mangan being one of his neighbors, one of his neighborhood friends, a boy who has a sister. Okay, and their family name is Mangan. All right, he watches her, all right, this unnamed boy, our narrator of the story, basically as a peeping Tom, right? He's kind of spying on her, watching her. If he wasn't such a young child, it would seem a very devious and disgusting behavior, but he is a naive adolescent or child, basically. He finally speaks to her, or more appropriately, she speaks to him, and I think that's important understanding the story, and asks if this unnamed boy is going to the bazaar, or a market, a temporary market called Araby. All right. She wishes to go, but she can't, because she is on a kind of religious retreat or a school trip, which is a religious retreat, which calls her convent. All right. But the boy says that he will go, and when he goes, he promises to buy her something at this market, Araby. After talking to her, and even before that, really, life becomes difficult for the boy as he becomes more and more obsessed about her and about this goal of buying something for her and kind of confirming his love, if not obsession, for her. He can't think, he can't concentrate in school. All right, he's just totally got a one-track mind about this whole Mangan's sister. All right, so finally he goes to the bazaar, the Araby, on Saturday night after his uncle comes home late and gives him the money. And he takes a long, lonely train across Dublin to arrive at the bazaar, and he gets there just as it is closing at 10 to 10. And upon entering the bazaar, he finds one kind of stall or kiosk where there is a young woman and two men speaking with English accents. The young woman comes over and asks if he wants to buy anything. He does not. Remember, he's promised to buy something for the girl, but he does not fulfill his promise to the girl. And he has an epiphany, okay? His dream, his desire has been futile and empty. And he is a creature, in his words, and the writer's words, a creature driven and derided by vanity. He feels pain and angered. All right, pained and angered at this situation. So that's the basic story. All right, so let's get a little bit more deeply into it and try to analyze some of the various aspects of the story, and there are many to analyze, and see if we can come to a better understanding of what this story means and what the story means to us individually. Remember, you can have one reading, you can have many readings. Some of those readings might be exclusive. They can't exist in the same reading. Some of them kind of can simultaneously exist. And as I said, the readings I have on this story, I've tried to include the ones that do kind of simultaneously exist. So when we believe this reading, it also has many layers of meaning as well that you can, or if you choose to, believe or agree with. All right, so let's begin with the beginning of the story. And I asked you in question 2 to describe the setting at the beginning. All right, and just as a note, actually, this story in many ways is somewhat biographical, at least in its setting. James Joyce did live at this address in Dublin at the time he was an adolescent. So this North Richmond Street, a blind street, is one that he lived on. And he did attend a Christian Brothers school, which is also described here too. All right. Okay, so let's just focus on some of the description here. As I said, it is a blind street, which means that it is a dead-end street. It doesn't go anywhere. Okay, one side is closed. You can come down this street, turn here, but you can't continue. You have to turn around and go out. Okay, if you're walking, or I don't think too many people had cars back in 1914. So it's a dead-end street or a blind street. Okay, whether you use that expression kind of determines it's English or American English, if you will. So James Joyce uses the term blind street, but dead-end street would be, I think, also appropriate here too. All right, and then we also get the description of the houses on this dead-end street, this blind street. The houses face each other, or using the language Joyce does, they gaze at each other. And again, compare that with the blind street and the gazing houses. There is a personification of these houses, these buildings on the street. They're also described as brown, which is very prominent, not only in this story, but in this whole short story cycle. And the brownness really kind of gives it a dullness. It's one of the most dull colors that you can imagine. In this story, you can see the girl is actually described as brown in many ways too. In many ways, that's kind of the whole environment is rubbing off on her. She is becoming her environment, or representing her environment at least. Okay, but in many ways here, these houses, these buildings, they are personified and almost seem more alive than the people that are living within them. Okay, they kind of seem to dominate in that way. All right, so they move on from describing these houses. The next paragraph describes the narrator's house, okay, the boy's house, the adolescent's house. We learn that a priest used to live in this home, but the priest died in this home. All right, I think that's meaningful, that it is a priest and that he died there. And then, of course, we get the atmosphere, right? All these words for the environment, not only here, but throughout the story, are fairly similar. Like brown is a common color that's used, but the idea of musty, dull, dirty, old, kind of rotting and dark. All right, this is fairly common, not only for describing the narrator's home, but also the whole environment of Dublin. All right, and then there is a brief discussion of the old damp books that belong to the priests. Okay, these are significant. We have Walter Scott's The Abbot, The Devout Communicant, which could be from one of three authors. There are a few published books called or referred to as The Devout Communicant. This one, James Joyce has left a little bit open, but there is meaning here. And the last one is The Memoirs of Vidocq. All right. So these three books are the ones that are left from the dead priest here, and they are meaningful. This is not an accident here. If you research these titles, you will find meaning to them. And if I have time, I'll include the meaning of these books that are found here as well. But next, we have described for the house a wild garden. All right, this is also very deliberate description, which invokes symbolism. So we have a wild garden behind the house that contained a central apple tree and a few struggling bushes, under one of which I found the late tenant's, the priest's, rusty bicycle pump. All right, so what's going on here? A garden with an apple tree. If you have any kind of knowledge of Christianity, this is obviously the Garden of Eden. All right, and we know what happens there in the story of Adam and Eve. That's quite meaningful. But we also have this rusty bicycle pump that belonged to the priest. I want you to think about that as a possible symbol, and hopefully I'll get a chance to come back in my explanations later and kind of describe that. All right. So we also get the description of the priest, which seems pretty sarcastic. All right. He had been a very charitable priest. In his will, he had left all his money to institutions and the furniture of his house to his sister. All right. This seems sarcastic, although the narrator's giving it fairly objectively. But a careful reader, if you think about it, can pick up a tone of sarcasm here. All right, so this priest had some money, all right, but he's being described as charitable. How can a priest get money and be charitable? All right, and what did he do with his money? Did he give his money to his sister, someone who's an actual person, a family member? No, he left the money to organizations and the furniture to his sister. So I think this is a subtle dig or kind of insult or making fun of the priest in a very subtle way. Okay, and that kind of language and subtlety that comes from it's the tone of the narrator. It's not really the tone. Sorry, it's the tone of the writer, but I don't think it's the tone of the boy, the narrator. I think there are levels here, as layers of meaning here, and this is one of the unique aspects of this story, and one part of Joyce's real genius. All right, you can listen to almost two narrators. You can hear the voice of the adult James Joyce, and normally I don't like to include the writer's voice so much. I like to keep the works of art or the stories separate. But in James Joyce, he does inject himself. As I said, there are elements of biographical information here. So when reading this story, I hear James Joyce's voice. Say that 3 times fast. But when I read the story, it is still sincerely a young boy's or an adolescent boy's voice of this time. I think that you hear them both together, and you can read them again simultaneously. So the young boy seems to just say objectively what this is, but a careful reader is going to hear James Joyce speaking also in this kind of naive, objective language of the boy. Okay, that's how I read this as well. All right, moving on. The next paragraph, the third paragraph, begins with a description of kind of the environment and the season. All right. When the short days of winter came, dusk fell before we'd eaten our dinners. When we met in the street, the houses had grown somber. The space of the sky above us was the color of ever-changing violet, and toward it the lamps of the street lifted their feeble lanterns. The cold air stung us until we played until our bodies glowed. Our shouts echoed in the silent street. The career of our play brought us through the dark muddy lanes behind the houses, where we ran the gauntlet of the rough tribes from the cottages to the back doors of the dark dripping gardens where odors arose from ash pits, to the dark odorous stables where a coachman smoothed and combed the horse or shook music from the buckled harness. Long run-on sentence there, part of his style. But what do we have here? Okay, it is winter. It is always dark, ever-changing violet. It is cold. It is dirty. It is smelly. It is quiet. The only thing described as warm and bright is the boys' or the children's bodies, if you include Mangan's sister as well. That's the only thing that you'll hear as being warm and bright. Okay, their bodies glowed. All right, so what is the purpose of this? That's the question here. Describe the setting and its importance. So that's the description. What is its importance? All of this description, well, it really does introduce a lot of symbol and imagery, but it also really helps to set the tone because it's at the beginning and foreshadow. Okay, if you don't know what foreshadowing is when you kind of you hint at what will come through the rest of the story. All right, it's almost like a nod and a wink. You introduce things that gets the reader thinking, and the reader can think, where is this story going? All right, that's foreshadowing. So all these elements, all right, that really create an environment and themes about religion and other aspects, which I won't talk about now. These set the tone and foreshadow the story. All right, like I said, it's a dead-end street with personified houses. All right, these seem to have more life than the people. And then think about the people too. Think about how the Christian Brothers School is described. All right, it is described as a jail. All right, and on this quiet street, the only time you'll hear noise is when these young boys are set free, released from the jail of the Christian Brothers School. All right, that's impactful. Right, we get that feeling of repression, of being locked up, of controlled. Also, the priest, the inclusion of the priest, and that also his home, and the books and the garden. We obviously are getting another dish of religion. Okay, we have the Christian Brothers, and now we have this home of a dead priest. All right, so the priest heavily introduces religion into the story, and specifically Catholicism. We're dealing with the Republic of Ireland here. All right, and just maybe to talk about the books briefly, I could talk about them at length, but the first one we have is The Abbot by Walter Scott. It is a story about Mary, Queen of Scots. It's kind of a historical fiction. It's a novel, but a historical fiction about Mary, Queen of Scots. And you have to know a little bit about history and a little bit about that book to really get this reference. I had to look it up, but I did to understand it better, because I know this is not an accident. All right. The Abbot is about Mary Scots finally leaving Scotland. Right. So consider, if you understand James Joyce, he grew up and talked about and loved and hated Ireland and had to leave it. Right. And a lot of his stories in this short story cycle and in this very story represents a journey as well. That's a major theme for James Joyce. So Mary Queen of Scots is leaving her homeland, Scotland, in this book. But also that book, if you understand Mary Queen of Scots and how she is kind of written about, she's kind of looked at as a promiscuous, kind of a whore figure. Her reputation by many historians and writers, contemporary writers of the time, is kind of savaged or ruined as well. But this particular book focuses on her not in a lascivious, kind of sexual, promiscuous way. This book, The Abbot, shows her in a more spiritual way. All right. And this really, introducing that in the second paragraph here as a book that clearly was one of the favorites of the priest, it sets the tone for the mixture of religion and sexuality. Okay, just that suggestion. A careful reader would be familiar with this book at this time, and they might be able to pick up or understand this reference, not clearly, just hinting at this, the ideas of religion and sexuality. All right, the developed communicant here, if you're a careful reader, I think it's speaking more to the use of language that you would find with the boy, and again, that really kind of mixes not only religion and sexuality, but also, I think, as I mentioned before, kind of it introduced the kind of language that Joyce is using here. So, as I said, the narrator has two voices, in my opinion. You have the adult voice of the writer and the child voice of the narrator, which is one and the same voice, but you can hear it in two different ways. All right? I know that sounds confusing, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to express there. Okay, so it's a matter of layering in the meaning. All right, and then of course the last book is the Memoirs of Vidocq, which the boy enjoys most because its leaves were yellow, musty, stained, old, well used. The plot of this novel, it's a French novel. You have a policeman who is in fact a criminal. All right, and it's kind of this mixture, this paradox of the law and the lawbreaker. And the policeman in the story uses his job as a policeman to cover up his crimes as well. So again, if you think about potential themes of religion and sexuality and how they seem to be opposed, religion, especially Catholicism, tries to control sexuality in many ways. All right. So, like the policeman covering up the crimes here, this book kind of has those themes, which are again considered in kind of the multi-layered meanings of this story. All right, the confusion, the moral confusion between police and criminal. All right, between sin and the sinner and God, if you want, or religion. Okay, so these books, just as references, as allusions to a careful reader, or just to James Joyce's own satisfaction, really introduce the kind of themes and set the tone for this story, in a way foreshadowing what is going to come in the story that he's telling. All right. Now, going back to the garden, right? What is the importance there? Again, as I mentioned, garden is a very common public symbol for Western literature, whether it's American or British or Irish or any of the Western, or even in many ways Eastern in this point. Anywhere you find Christianity, which is around the world and is just so publicly known, a garden is a very public, common symbol that represents often kind of the biblical paradise of Eden. All right, and the story of Adam and Eve can be invoked here. All right, so again, we're talking about religion, but we're also learning that this story is going to intersect with sexuality as well. So there's this it introduces this unhealthy mix of religion and sexuality. Okay, and it does it in a kind of cheeky way. All right, we know the garden, and then the apple tree, and Eve bites the apple, and she learns carnal knowledge. Okay, which makes her mortal, and she is forever burdened with the having to give birth to children, right? That's kind of her penalty, if you want to call that, in the Christian religion. Okay, I'm being simple about it here too, right? And then that represents the fall of mankind in this case. So Adam and Eve, because Adam supports Eve and lies for her, they are kicked out of paradise. They're kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and thus they come to earth to populate the earth with us sinners. All right. And then what else is found in that garden but the priest's rusty bicycle pump? All right. This is a cheeky symbol. It is a phallic symbol, meaning it represents the male genitalia. All right. The penis, if you will. But it is rusty and there lying and rotting in the Garden of Eden, owned by a now dead priest, right? So again, these kind of these images, if you will, create a mixed representation of religion and sexuality. All right, and obviously, if we move on, we can read into the description of the charitable priest and what he left all his money. Again, how does a charitable priest accumulate money? He couldn't have been that charitable if he kept it, right? And he gives only the furniture of the house to his sister. So again, I think that's sarcastic. And that sarcasm, which I think you're hearing from the voice of the writer, Joyce, not the voice of the narrator child. But here, I think you can see how religion is set in a negative tone, right? And I think the rusty bicycle pump also helps that. All right, and moving on, when we talk about this description of the season, how is that important? Again, it represents the larger natural environment, not just the street and this house, but kind of expands the season and the time in which these characters in the story takes place, and it's one that is dark and oppressive and cold, and it really stymies or represses the spirit and growth and love and warmth and brightness of these glowing bodies of these children, especially the character. All right, so again, this really sets the tone and foreshadows that this environment is coming down on this glowing body. It's making it a difficult environment for it to continue to grow, right? It's not going to burst out into bright flames. It's controlling its growth from the warmth that comes from within is being stymied or oppressed by an oppressive environment outside. All right, so I hope that answers the question about how the setting is described and what its importance is to the story in developing tone and foreshadowing what is to come in meaningful ways. All right, number 3, what is Araby literally and symbolically? Okay, what does it represent symbolically to the narrative story? Right, literally, easy enough. What is Araby? It is an Eastern themed bazaar or market. All right, that means it's kind of a traveling market. It's temporary. It's not one that is always there in Dublin. It's open maybe once a year, or it's probably traveling around Ireland or the UK. All right, and actually they can biographically find the exact date, March, I think, or sorry, May 16th to 19th. There was one called Araby in Dublin at this time as well, in 1914. No, not 1914. When James Joyce was a youngster. I think biographical studies have narrowed this down, but it is just this a temporary Eastern themed. Okay, Araby just means Arabic in kind of colloquial English around Ireland and the UK. So it's an Arabic themed or Eastern themed, Mid-Eastern in this case, market or bazaar. All right, what does it represent? I think the character really, the narrator, pretty much tells you what it represents. All right, it represents a foreign environment. It represents one of hope to the narrator. Okay, it is spellbinding. It casts, as the narrator says, an Eastern enchantment. It's like a spell, right? He's looking off, say, dreaming of the magic of this foreign place. Because remember, his setting is quite dark and cold and old and repressed. He wants to break out. He wants something new. All right, and in that way, it kind of the woman, the young girl, Mengen's sister, represents that. If you want to, she and her, I think, combined. I think you have to consider Araby and Mengen's sister in some kind of combination. All right, she is described as brown, which in one way represents the dullness of the city, but it also represents kind of, not to be too racial here, but kind of the brownness of the Eastern people, of Arabic people, a foreignness to the typical pale Irish, which are my ancestors also. So you can interpret that in many ways. All right, and you can also interpret how, as I said, there's a mixture of religion and sexuality. Mengen's sister also represents, I think you can read it in this ways, the religion, because she is a Dubliner, but he finds kind of a hope in love and desire in her, but he also, in the same way, finds that in something foreign, something other. Okay, so there's a lot happening here. You can understand Mengen's sister as a representation of the Virgin Mary, of purity, and something that the boy is worshiping. But you can also see her connected to the bazaar, which is something foreign and new and magical to the boy, all right, who is becoming a man in many ways. So you can read into this, like I said, so many different layers here, all right? And depending on what you want to focus on, they're not exclusive. They can exist at the same time. Mengen's sister is that desire of the boy, and Araby is the desire of the boy, all right? The foreignness, to escape, to find some sort of magic outside of this dull, cold, repressive environment. All right, they can both exist in those readings here. All right, so that's basically what Araby represents. Okay, it is literally a bazaar, a market that is themed in Middle Eastern or Arabic things, right? And at the same time, it represents a desire in the boy, all right, to find some sort of love, whether it be romantic or purely sexual or both, in Mengen's sister, who he's become obsessed with. All right, but keep in mind too that Mengen's sister does carry that element. She kind of works as a double-edged symbol of both Dublin, becoming Dublin, and also the foreignness, right? And that is impactful for when we get to the end, and we see the emotional response that the character, the main character, the narrator, has. All right, let's move on to question 4. Hopefully, keep that in mind, and we'll come back to some of the ideas I've planted. Number 4, how is religion, specifically Catholicism, represented in this story? All right, I don't think, not in my mind, that there are many ways to see Catholicism or religion represented positively in this story. All right. Remember, we had the Christian school presented as a jail, which sets free the boys, and that is the only time where it's loud and lively, not dead. Okay. The only time it's not quiet is when the boys are released or set free from the prison of their Christian school. So go back to what I said about question 2. Right. Also, we have that description of the dead priest, and how his house was musty and old, and we get this kind of sarcasm that describes him, and how the mixture of sex and religion is included in his garden as well. All right, and of course, the environment, the overall environment, which comes after the description of Christian school and this priest, the religion, the overall environment of Dublin is described as being confusing and confounding and stymieing or oppressing the energy of the glowing bodies of the burgeoning youth. All right, so just know that throughout this story, I want to get that deeper in my next answer, but throughout this story, you will or should see a lot of references, not only the ones I've talked about, but further references, whether they be images or symbolisms of religion, and they're deeply written into the story of this adolescent's sexual awakening. Okay, and again, you can read that sexual awakening purely, literally, as the boy's growth to maturity, but you can also read it metaphorically in many ways, which I'll get to as well. All right, and that leads us into the next question. All right, and keep in mind what I've been discussing so far. Let's try to just keep this discussion flowing. So question number 5 is, what has the narrator learned or realized at the end of the story? Or if we want to use Joyce's vocabulary, which we probably should, what is this character's epiphany? All right, Joyce loves to use the word epiphany, which means a sudden realization. But the word epiphany, its etymology, its root, goes back to one of religion. So again, James Joyce likes to be cheeky, and he is deeply critical of religion, specifically Catholicism. But in this story, and in many of his stories, especially in Dubliners, there is this epiphany. All right. At the end of the story, a character has a sudden realization. Okay, that's really important, and we'll talk about this. One of the techniques James Joyce relies on a lot. Now, when I say epiphany, this sudden realization, you might have a very positive, affirmative connotation. You should not. Most of these connotations are not positive, right? And I will argue that this story, and many of the stories in this short story collection are not at heart positive or affirmative. Okay, remember, we're in the modernist times and things are quite desperate. A lot of the themes of alienation, which I'm not going to really discuss in this story, but it is very appropriate to discuss alienation, this feeling of being separated, of being an individual, not in a greater society, a loving, wholesome one, but being a collection of individuals within a society, but feeling alienated, othered. All right. So let's go back to the epiphany. What has the narrator learned or realized at the end of the story? Well, how do you want to read this story? All right, as I said, there's so many different ways to read it. It works in many ways, and in many ways simultaneously at the same time. And that, again, is really the beauty of James Joyce. I think rarely will you find a writer that can layer a story so variously and so deeply, right? So, on the surface, the narrator's reaction, his epiphany, it is a realization that his desire has been futile, all right? This Araby, this foreign Middle Eastern bazaar, is not that foreign. Okay, look at his reaction. He hears English accents and sees simple vases and flowered teacups. So in his mind, he was dreaming of this magical Arabic bazaar. But when he gets there, it's a couple of English people selling flowered teacups and vases. Okay, pretty disappointing compared to what he had in his mind. And then, of course, the young woman at the bazaar speaks to him. She's speaking with two other young Englishmen, but she comes over and asks him if he wishes to buy something. And this, in many ways, mirrors the action of Mangan's sister. Remember, Mangan's sister talks to him first, and here he doesn't call over the young woman. She comes to him and speaks to him first. And here is where you get the epiphany, the realization. He realizes that it's just her job to sell things. He asks her, or she asks him, "Do you wish to buy something?" And he simply says, "No, thank you." Right? That's all. And here the spell is broken. He is no longer enchanted by the East. He has his epiphany. His desire, his hope, and his dream have burst. He has no hope, and he is paralyzed. He is left gazing into the darkness. All right? A creature driven and derided for vanity. All right, so that's where he is. He's paralyzed. He can't move. And just everything around him now he sees is dark. And we get this emotional response of feeling a creature, not a human, a creature driven and derided by vanity. So what is at the root of this epiphany? How can we understand this emotional response to this action? To this epiphany? Well, again, we have many layers to examine. So let's examine it on those many levels. One, we could say quite literally, without getting too deep into the symbolic, he realized that there is no romance, no love. Okay, and he was childishly, naively obsessed with Mangan's sister. Right? It was not really love. It was just an obsession, a one-sided love. So this exchange with the young woman at the bazaar really kind of causes this, right? It's this one side. She's just doing her duty. It's described as, dutiful, right? Any imagination of romance comes from the boy. And the boy in this recognizes that, this is, maybe it triggers a response to when the Mangan sister spoke to him. She didn't ask him anything other than, "Were you going to the bazaar?" But in his mind, he had blown up, just like he had blown up the idea of Araby into his, enchanting, magical foreign place. The girl, who is just a common Dublin girl, right? He had blown up into, his desire, his hopes, his dreams. But at this moment, really, he realized there is no romance, there is no love. It's a childish, naive obsession that he has. All right. So on another level, but maybe just continuing with that realization. All right. One way to read this book, this story, is as what's called a Bildungsroman, or a coming of age story. All right. It works on many levels. Notice that the boy doesn't live with his mother and father. He lives with the aunt and uncle. That's common, right? Think about Harry Potter or a lot of coming of age stories. You have a young child or a young teenager who becomes an adult. That's called a coming of age story. This is one of those, but it's not really a positive one. All right. But in those stories, the hero or the protagonist, the main character, is usually separated from their parents. Okay, that goes also back to the idea of alienation, which is part of modernism and part of the theme of this story and many of Joyce's works. But here it also fits with the story of this being a coming of age story. All right, and of course the coming of age is the maturity, reaching sexuality, mature sexuality, moving from child to adult. And in the story, the collection Dubliners, it's about child, adolescent, adult. If you read the various different short stories, and this one is the ending of childhood, all right, or the ending of adolescence into adulthood. So this epiphany is the epiphany that he is a child no more. All right. His childish idealism has burnt up. His romanticism has burnt up. And now he's got to enter a more practical, realistic, modernism, okay? Realistic perspective of his environment, of his identity, okay? So that also works on this coming of age story, right? And it also works on the layer of individual, but also you can read into it on the national level of Ireland, and also on a cultural level, from moving from romanticism to modernism. All right, and yet another layer here. Let's maybe try to keep it simple. The third way, I guess, to look at this is he realizes the effect of his environment on him, and of all Dubliners, including Mangan's sister. And here I would emphasize the effect of religion, specifically the Catholic Church. So the story is portrayed by Joyce. The Catholic Church is portrayed by Joyce as this oppressive force, as I said, innocently through the objective descriptions of the child. But I think, again, we also hear the author's voice simultaneously through the narrator's voice, or the child's voice. So you have the writer's voice and the narrator's voice. Okay, the James Joyce's voice and the child's voice are one and the same, telling one objective story and one deeply symbolic story. So the boy doesn't directly criticize the church, but the writer does. Okay, that's what I mean here. And we can get that, like I said, through the rich, careful, deep symbolism that is included. Okay, these symbols are not conscious to the narrator, the young boy, but they're conscious to the writer, James Joyce, and hopefully they're conscious to the careful reader of the story as well. So throughout the short story, the boy's actions can be seen or read, if you want, can be read as a kind of religious devotion and a journey, a pilgrimage. Okay, and again, that's his coming of age story from child to adulthood. It's a kind of a religious pilgrimage here, but you can look at the actions he does. But going back to the mixture, the confusing, confounding, and almost kind of creepy mixture of a repressive, stymieing religion and a burgeoning, like, creative sexuality and identity, all right, individual identity. They're intertwined and intermixed in a very kind of almost disgusting way, right? Anyway, a dark, creepy way. All right, just like a rusty bicycle pump rotting in a garden. So we can read the boy's actions as a kind of religious devotion, but we can also read them as just how can I say it? A boy exploring and awakening to his sexuality as he becomes an adult. All right, so we have his devotion to, on one level, the devotion of the boy to Mangan's sister. Okay, Mangan's sister, as I said, could be meant to represent the Virgin Mary, which is a symbol of purity. And this boy is devoted to that aspect, the life of being Catholic and living in Ireland, living in Dublin, and how that affects him, right? And how even the Mangan's sister, the girl, she's described with that brown hair, all right, a rope swung like a rope. Okay, she is also described in other kind of Christian imagery, which I don't want to get into now. But she's also at the same time described in very sexual ways, as the boy's kind of peeping on her and watching her and the way he sees her. It's a kind of mixed image of Mary, the symbol of purity, but also for the boy, a symbol, a place for his sexuality, a target of his sexuality. He deeply wants to be, involved with this girl. And what does he do? He almost worships her. He follows her. He watches her. He thinks about her. He, in a way, prays to her and loves her. That is all in a religious sense. But if you read that carefully, it's a very sexual sense as well, right? He sexualizes her, all right? If you don't believe me, you can read the story, and you will find words like, her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood, all right? The power of her name operates on a layer of Christianity, of religion as well. But the foolish blood also speaks to his body, how his reaction, his sexual reaction to her, right? Just thinking about her excites him to a certain degree. All right, and then if you want further evidence of that, I would recommend that you closely read the passage on the second page. All right, when he goes into the back drawing room, I'll read it for you now. All right. One evening I went into the back drawing room in which the priest had died. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house. All right. Keep in mind, this is the same room where the priest had died. Okay, where religion had died to a certain degree. And then, well, what happens next? Let's skip ahead. All my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves, and, feeling that I was about to slip from them, I pressed the palm of my hands together until they trembled, murmuring, oh love, many times. All right. God bless this for being literature, all right? Because in literature, it's not a movie. You don't have to show definitively one thing or another thing. So this is the layers that I'm talking about. All right, what is he doing here? What is this imagery? What is this description? Right? Obviously, it is an action described in religious ways, with religious language, and the actions at least resemble religion. Okay? You can quite easily say he's praying. All right? However, without much imagination, you can also imagine that this boy is secretly going into this back room with his mind full of these sexualized images of Mangan's sister. All right, and far be it from me to say what teenage boys do when they are in love and obsessed with a girl, but I'll let you decide. If he's not praying, what is he doing? Okay, so again, this mixture of religion and sexuality crosses paths. Okay, and like I said, they can exist simultaneously, but the religion is infusing his spirit and his mind and his reality here. So in many ways, I think this kind of describes from the author, okay, the author's voice. James Joyce is saying how Ireland's society is constantly frustrated and confused in their desires. Right, I could go a lot deeper on this topic. I haven't even discussed the relationship of Ireland and England, which is also an oppressive force. And at this time, too, there was what was called the Celtic Revival, which is a nationalist Irish movement where they were trying to push back against England, which was a kind of colonial oppressor. And in many ways, there was also kind of a pushback against Catholicism, of which Joyce would definitely align. And this story definitely pushes back against Catholicism. Joyce was always highly critical of religion and Catholic influence in Ireland. All right, so again, so much more to go into, but I hope that's enough evidence and enough meaning to really talk about what's going on here. All right, so just to review, this story ends with an epiphany. All right, and it is a realization that his desire was empty. Okay, no matter what you think that desire was, if it's just simply, literally, a desire for Mangan's sister and a love between them, that's gone. Or if you want to think it's the romantic, childish, hopeful idealism that he has is gone. Okay, and along that, there's many ways to discuss that, but I'll discuss in the next question, number 6. But whatever it is that he desired, he hoped for, it's gone. It's empty. All right? And he is angry and embarrassed because he feels naive. All right? Because his hope is gone. That is his epiphany. So why doesn't he buy anything for the girl? Because he sees how empty and futile his dream, his desire, his hope was. Right? So he's stuck there and he is left paralyzed. Okay, he can't move, he can't do anything. He's stuck there. All right, I'll continue on this and hopefully develop it in answering the last question. Number 6. If this is not a simple love story, then what is it about? All right, well, do you want it to be a simple love story? Good for you. If I have to answer this question honestly, I would say absolutely not. This is not a simple love story. There is nothing simple about it, and there really is no love. Okay, like I said, the boy is obsessed with the girl. It's not a love story by any means. I would argue, I think a coming of age story is the probably easiest way to understand it. So we get this change from an adolescent, a teenager, to an adult understanding of the world through epiphany, right? This realization. And that realization seems to be when the child becomes an adult. In many ways, as I said, is a story of how childish hope is defeated and replaced with passive acceptance. Like I said, this is not a happy ending. It's not a happy story. Okay, none of these stories really are hopeful. Let me get into what James Joyce is doing, all right, as critics generally understand it. Not only in this story, but in many of his stories, all right? As I said, there is a paralysis. So this is a common theme, 2 themes in Dubliners: paralysis and kind of roundabout journeys that end up where they started. Okay, this story includes both of them. So the paralysis. So we get to the beginning of the story. We have a naive, childish boy with a romantic hope of foreign lands and a new love. Okay, and then through his journey, and it is described almost as such until the end. All right, then his hope vanishes and is replaced with this paralysis. He can't move. He just realizes the darkness that surrounds him because the hope is gone. The kind of fire burning in him kind of fizzles out, right? So in many of Joyce's stories, we get desire. We're introduced to a character who has a hope or desire. And then in the story, there are these constant or immovable obstacles to achieving that desire. All right. So instead of overcoming these obstacles, like if we go look at other stories, other writers, okay, who write romantic stories or who write other coming of age stories, or any other kind of progress narratives, which are more affirmative or positive, right? Those characters overcome those obstacles and they're rewarded in the end with, love or treasure or some sort of positive growth. We do not get positive growth in this story. We are left with a character that is stuck in paralysis, stuck in the dark realm of the dead and dying, right? In fact, the last story of Dubliners, my favorite short story of all time, is called The Dead, in which the character has an epiphany that he is stuck in the world of the dead and dying, and there's really no difference between the living and the dead. Okay? Not hopeful. But, of course, remember, this is modernist times, and this is realist writing. Okay? So, as I said, of course, you can read this story on many levels. You can read it as an individual, right? This boy and his relationship with the young woman. You can read this on the level of a nation, of Ireland. You can read this biographically on the level of James Joyce's experience with his time in Ireland and abroad. Or you can read this in a larger context of modernist society and how the individual in society feels, right? Like I said, we talked about modernism, the simple definition. Modernism is a deliberate and radical break with traditional norms of Western culture. All right? So forget about the romantic ideas. Forget about the progress narratives. Forget about, the overcoming, the hopefulness. We are stuck now, paralyzed and self-conscious, questioning the future and what will come, right? Are we dead? Are we among the dying? There is that kind of very dark sensibility and sense of alienation in this story. All right, so I hope you don't find that too depressing. I can see how you might want to hold on to the idea that this is a simple love story because you are young and hopeful, and I don't want to take away that young hope from you. But I hope I have supplied you with some interesting perspective on this story. All right, and that is the more kind of critical reading of this story as well. Okay, I'm sorry this video is going long. Like I said, I could talk for days on this. But let me quickly get to the midterm preparation. As I said, your midterm test will be Friday. Okay, I think the 22nd? Anyway, next Friday in the 9 to 11 o'clock schedule in room 404. That means on Wednesday we will meet for a 1-hour class, and hopefully I'll get a chance to see you then. Please come to that class. Please come to all our in-person classes. And that one specifically so we can prepare and review for the test in person together. So let's talk about what you should do and what this test is. All right. You should now and before the test make sure you have carefully read these 4 stories and you have done your best to sincerely answer the discussion questions in your own words. Okay? That's what you can do to prepare. All right? If you have questions or concerns in the course of reading or rereading or answering these questions, or rereading or re-answering these questions, or just further analysis about these stories, please bring those questions or concerns to the classroom on Wednesday. All right. As for the test, how is it constructed? All right. This hopefully will make sense to you. It will come in 3 sections. The first section will be identification questions. So that means I will give you some sentences from the stories, the different stories, and they will not be identified by which story they are. Your job to answer this question is to read the short passage, right? It might be 2 or 3 sentences, and then write the title of the story from where those sentences come from. So you must identify writing from these stories. Okay, you probably get 5 or 6 of those questions. Next section, section 2, is short answer. All right. You will have a group of questions, maybe 10. And what I'll do is I'll give you a choice. All right. So there might be 10 short answer questions. But you will have your choice and maybe be able to choose possibly 6 questions to answer. Right? So again, I want to give you some freedom here because, some of us read the stories differently, or some of us understand symbolism better, characterization better, imagery better, whatever. Okay? So I don't want to favor certain students who had a different, more positive engagement with the questions that I'm offering. So you get a certain amount of choice. So you might get to choose 6 of 10 and answer those questions. So the ones that you don't really understand, you can avoid and hopefully answer questions of which you have something more interesting to say. All right. Next, you'll have long answer, paragraph answer. All right. Short answer, I only want 2, 3, 4 sentences. Okay. You're only going to be getting 2 or 3 marks for each short answer question. So don't go too long, but remember how to answer the question satisfactorily. The long answer, I want, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sentences. I want a paragraph, a constructed paragraph. Okay. Again, you'll have the same option. You might get 5 questions and you will have to answer maybe 2 of those questions in full paragraphs. All right. So keep that in mind. The long answer questions will be worth probably twice as much, okay, as the short answer questions. So I'm expecting to write or develop twice as much in your answer. So keep that in mind when you're writing the test. All right. Short answer, less marks. Keep it short. Long answer has to be long. I want 5 or 6 check marks to give you. So give me your main idea and 5 or 6, explanations and pieces of evidence. Okay. Now, what's important here too when you're reviewing, remember the discussion questions that I gave you for each of these readings. All of the questions that you will find on this midterm will be similar, if not the same, to the discussion questions that we have done for each of the readings. So there's no surprises here. The discussion was there to try and get you to engage in reading these stories. and to sharpen your ability to communicate your ideas about the stories. So on this test, I'm looking for you to demonstrate with skill your ability to communicate your ideas about these stories. All right? So remember what I've said about what makes for a good answer and a bad answer. You can say anything you want, but the difference between a good answer and a bad answer is how you can convincingly and clearly communicate a reasonable answer that is supplied with evidence and explanation. Okay, and keep in mind a short answer, get to the point quickly. All right, so if it's worth 2 or 3 points, tell me directly your idea and give me a piece of evidence and an explanation, or 2 explanations, or 2 pieces of evidence. Evidence should have explanation, though. All right. Same thing when you get to a long answer. What is your answer? Tell me directly, and then give me, 5 supporting sentences that give evidence or clear, reasonable explanation for your answer and what you believe in. And remember, the more extraordinary your ideas are, the more extraordinary your evidence and explanation must be. All right. Anyway, I hope you prepare for that exam well. Do the reading again. Make sure you can satisfactorily answer those questions with reasonable explanation and reasonable evidence. If you have any questions or concerns, bring them to the class on Wednesday, and we will also get another explanation of the test, and hopefully we'll review some of the questions you might have about this literature. All right, take care, everybody. I'm really looking forward to seeing you next week.